Hello, this is David Harper. Welcome to a brief introduction to the Foundations of Risk Management topic, which is the first topic in the FRM. Here's the notation that we use, P1.T1. The P1 stands for Part 1 as opposed to Part 2 of the FRM. And then within Part 1 of the FRM, as you probably know, there are 4 topics. So we're starting with Topic 1, or T1, then T2, T3, and T4. And then when we get to Part 2 of the FRM, we start with T5, which happens to be market risk. So in this brief video, I'm not going to review any of the assigned readings, just want to give you a taste or introduction to the foundations topic and what we generally care about in foundations. And it includes these ideas. A helicopter view, which includes the question of what is the definition of risk? Turns out not to be an easy question to answer. What does corporate risk look like? And risk governance. We also have in this foundations topic case studies, and we've had these for several years, and these are really relevant and important to the candidate. Then we have a newer reading by John Hull on the credit crisis, as you might expect. And we also have theory on the capital asset pricing model, which is controversial or debatable, because we can certainly take the position that in practice the capital asset pricing model isn't realistic and isn't used by many practitioners. Of course we can take that view, but from the perspective of the FRM, some proficiency in the capital asset pricing model is important. I will tell you now. It comes up in Part 2 of the FRM as well. One of the reasons is simply that there are other ideas that are more common in practice that, whether we know it or not, are actually borrowing from capital asset pricing theory. So the risk-adjusted performance measures, or what I call RAPM, these are relevant and would include here, for example, a Sharpe ratio. That's something that's used oftentimes in practice, the Sharpe ratio, and it's related to the capital asset pricing model theory. So that section is important in Part 1. And then, of course, we do have GARP's Code of Conduct. For shorthand, sometimes call that ethics. And there always are at least a couple or few questions on the FRM that borrow from the Code of Conduct, but not too many questions. Okay, so in terms of a definition of risk, as I mentioned, it's not always going to be easy to answer that question, but we don't want to get too legalistic here, too rigorous. Depends a little bit on context and what we're talking about. And in a way, the FRM, which again is about financial risk, not about non-financial risks. So financial risks are a set of risks, and there's quite a bit of theory now, but we are really sort of exploring the definition of risk in the separate domains within financial risk. So we don't get too attached to a specific definition. It's not like the exam is going to say, going to necessarily tie us down to one definition or another, because we're going into, in fact, quite a deep exploration of risk through the different topics. And although two of the more commonly used ones, this first one here is from Philip Jorian, who's been a popular author with the FRM and currently has, I think, 3 readings in the FRM. In times, historically, he's had more, but he would say, or has written, that risk is the volatility of unexpected outcomes. And so then we've got that keyword volatility there. Another definition that we've seen, for example, in a reading that was in the Foundations last year, but is not this year, so you can see how I'm not getting too attached to any particular definition, but here, there the definition was, risk is the potential for the occurrence of a loss. And we cannot separate that idea of risk from growth opportunities. So it's not that these are not important, but just in a sense that we're going well beyond superficial definitions. We're going into very specific applications of risk. And I would finally mention there's this so-called Knightian uncertainty, and I do think this is relevant for us, just as general idea, the distinction between uncertainty and risk. And he had said that uncertainty refers to many of the real life scenarios where we don't have a lot of information and we can't really measure that kind of risk. So uncertainty seems, at least to me, to be a very real condition for us. But in terms of financial risk and what we're doing in the FRM and application, you'll see most of the time we're dealing with measurements. So if there is an art and science, it's about the translation of the uncertainty that's very real for us into quantifiable risk. And so when we mean risk, we really have this aspiration to measure or quantify it. And that turns out to be very difficult to do because it's forward-looking. In terms of origins of risk, there can be several: human, natural disasters, and economic growth. And so we don't get too attached to the various sources, and we'll see, especially in part 2, the Basel regulations, there's many origins of risk. I did include here an idea from Renee Stolz, another popular author in the FRM, the distinction between business and financial risk. So business risk here, the key idea here is that it's deliberate and necessary. And in a sense, all businesses do assume risk. And it's not as if their owners or shareholders expect them to eliminate all risk. There is such a thing as a riskless investment. Maybe that's a Treasury security, a U.S. Treasury security, but maybe not. That's not even riskless. So owners and shareholders do expect their investments in businesses to assume smart risks or certain kinds of risk. So it's not as if we're trying to avoid all risk. And this is just relates to the idea that there is a set of risks, business risks, that shareholders pay for and expect the firms to assume, as opposed to financial risks. And now, if I could ask you just to think about non-financial firms for a second, just a manufacturer, for example, they're not necessarily in the business of assuming the financial risks. A bank or financial institution would be. So we do tend to distinguish sharply between financial and non-financial companies. And with respect to non-financial companies, which is most companies, they are not necessarily in the business of assuming risk. And so the Stolz idea here would be that for these non-financial firms, since that's not their core business, they at least want to consider hedging. So we think about that a lot. And financial risk management, then broadly, is the design and implementation of procedures for identifying, measuring, and managing the financial risks. I'm sure there's a lot behind each of these, but in a way, it's that simple. We first do have to identify the risk. And there are several case studies where this right here was just the problem. We're just not an awareness of the risk. But secondly, it's probably not enough just to be aware of the risk vaguely. We want to measure it. And then third, we want to manage the risk. And again, the FRM is really concerned with financial risks. There are many risks that are not under that financial risk umbrella. And now with respect to these financial risks, I would just like to introduce to you the typology. There's no reading currently in Foundations that concerns this typology, and that's because the typology is implicit in the overall structure of the FRM, and in particular Part 2. So I've got a little diagram here, and you can notice that market risk here happens to be topic 5 of Part 2, credit risk happens to be topic 6, and operational risk happens to be topic 7, and then finally investment risk is topic 8, and then we have current issues as topic 9. But for example, the Basel regulations is mostly concerned with 3 major buckets of financial risk, and they're right here: market risk, credit risk, operational risk. See how that maps to T5, T6, and T7 of the Part 2 of the FRM? And so this These three buckets, market, credit, and operational risk, constitute a lot of what we end up studying in part 2 of the FRM. Now there are obviously many additional variants, but some of these are just sub-risks. For example, liquidity risk is very important and has been in recent years since the crisis. Liquidity risk, but arguably that is a subclass of market risk, depending on the position we want to take. Counterparty risk also become very important in recent years, but it's a subclass of credit risk. And then Basel II and Basel III I've got here just because organizationally the FRM has Basel under operational risk. But you can see here generally there's a map of what we study in part 2. So market risk, and then we have credit risk, and then operational risk. I would also, in this brief introduction to Foundation, just want to introduce you to value at risk. This is explored more in topics 3 and 4 of part 1. So VAR is in both topic 3 and topic 4 in a pretty big way, and it's throughout part 2. And so VAR turns out to be one of our very important metrics, by no means the only metric that we look at. One of the things we'll study is the shortcomings of VAR and how some of the authors, in particular Dowd, will propose more superior metrics to value at risk. However, from the perspective of the FRM, value at risk is without a doubt our starting point in terms of measurement. And so the VAR summarizes the worst loss over a target horizon that will not be exceeded with a given level of confidence. And even in this introduction, I just wanted to operationalize this for you because you're going to see it again, and not only that, it's highly, highly testable. And so here's the generic statement. If we're using VAR, if we can say something like, under normal conditions, the most the portfolio can lose over a given horizon is some dollar or percentage amount at some level of confidence. And so here's an example of a VAR statement. Under normal conditions, the most the portfolio can lose over a month is about 3.6 million at the 99% confidence level. So there's quite a bit packed into the seemingly simple statement, including 2 sort of user decisions or designs that we want to make. We specify a confidence and we specify horizon. So you can see here there's a 99% confidence level and there's a horizon of 1 month here. Because we can select either one of those and mix and match, there's an almost infinite variety of value at risk statements we can make. But notice, it's appropriately probabilistic. There's nothing certain about it. And I'm going to go to the next slide now and show you the equivalent statement in the way that I prefer it under normal conditions. And you can notice here I forgot the 1 month horizon, but because I have that here. Under normal conditions over 1 month, the portfolio should lose at least 3.6. I'm just going to write that in right now. Over 1 month, over a 1 month horizon. I want to start again. Under normal conditions over a 1 month horizon, the portfolio should lose at least 3.6 million about 1% of the time. I'm also going to insert there an approximator. To me, that's important because it reminds us that VAR is not actually precise. We may quantify it very specifically, but we don't pretend that it's precise. Under normal conditions over a 1 month horizon, there's the horizon I've decided to specify. The portfolio should lose at least 3.6 million. So notice it's actually mathematically equivalent to this statement with a 99% confidence. But here, semantically, I'm emphasizing the fact that value at risk does expect to be exceeded, or we expect losses to exceed our VAR, in this case, about 1% of the time. So not very often, but sometimes. So there's nothing certain about VAR. And by the way, it's always one tail. It's never two tail. I get this question every year in the forum. Just wanted to include that there. And when we go to look at VAR, really broadly, there's going to be two approaches. A non-parametric or empirical. And so here's just an example of a distribution of profits and losses. You can see it sort of looks normal here. And VAR is going to select a quantile and say that here's our significance level, here's our confidence level as the area under the curve. And so given this sort of empirical distribution, VAR is going to expect losses to exceed this level, whatever this tail area is, 1 or 5% of the time. But the point here is that this approach is, you can see, it's not smooth, it's not based on a mathematical function, it's based on some collection of actual empirical data. And this does turn out to be the most popular way to approach value at risk among banks currently, among the big banks. There are many variations of this historical simulation, but the key point here is we're using actual data. As opposed to, we always use data, but you might use data to inform a parametric distribution, like, for example, here, a normal distribution that we'll use often in the FRM just because it's a very elegant and efficient learning tool. But here I actually do have a normal distribution. So don't get me wrong, data is used to select the parameters or calibrate that distribution. But then once we've used the data, we discard the data, and then we've got a smooth mathematical function with only two parameters. And so similarly, same concept for VAR, we select the quantile and say, with, in this case, 5% confidence, we expect the VAR to be exceeded. But in this case, whereas before it was empirical, i.e. non-parametric, in this case, it's based on a distribution, so we say it's a parametric approach, also called sometimes analytical VAR. Okay, so that was empirical or parametric as opposed to parametric or analytical VAR. But my only point here was just to introduce you to the concept of value at risk, which is a probabilistic statement that is based on our selection of a horizon, a time horizon that could be 1 day, could be 1 month, it could be 1 year, and then some confidence level, typically either 95 or 99%, and then we're just probabilistically saying, based on some method to arrive at a distribution, that we expect the losses to exceed the VAR, in this case, 5% of the time. So that VAR concept turns out, if we think about it for a little bit, to be really pretty simple. It's just the methods to get us the answer that are not only varied, but can get complicated. Here again, as the final slide, just wanted to show you the notation, because we'll see this again, and maybe if you don't have a mathematical background, it might be a little intimidating at first. The probability here that the loss is going to exceed the VAR level is less than or equal to 1 minus the confidence level. And so that's just the notational equivalent to what I've been trying to introduce you to. And at least in the FRM, following with statistical conventions, you'll at least on the exam, you'll only see a 95 or 99%. Well, I should, at least in certain applications, when we get into operational risk, we do want more confidence, and so we will see 99.9 and then even 99.99. That's a very high level of confidence in some cases. But at least in part 1, we're going to be using 95 or 99% confidence. So you're going to get quite familiar with the deviates there that correspond. That's the 1.65 here and 2.33 here. But it's really going to be those two levels that we care about. And as before, always one-tailed. And so that's really just an introduction to the foundations topic. I look forward to sharing more with you in future videos. Thank you.